So last time I remember us mentioning a couple of times IFS therapy, right? And if I remember correctly, it was internal family systems, correct? Perfect. Okay. Um, and it got me thinking, not just this, but also in uni, every now and then we got told about different types of therapy modalities that you as a therapist eventually can choose from. And what I find interesting is it does, or in uni until now, they don't really teach you the different types, which I find interesting because it's such an important part later as a therapist. And it does get me, or it got me interested, and I'm still interested in knowing what are the different types out there. What are the types that I would be interested in? In that regards, I would be interested what you guys, what the experience was for you guys, right? Back in the day when you were in uni slash later in the career life, how did you guys navigate that, the finding these different modalities, what works, or even now, finding out what's out there, how can I find my own style? That,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. I mean, I remember being in probably my third year of uni and having those same questions, I guess, and
hmm
also being a bit confused, like what is the modality or the approach that resonates more with me as a person. And I remember there was this like big emphasis on it has to be scientific, right? Like you have to like psychology is like a science, so it has to be like database and it has to be so there's like these like behavioral approaches that I think were the ones that I was more connected to at the beginning of my career. um and I think for me, it has been like like a big journey because I worked in schools as a counselor. And when you are in counseling, and Cindy will share her experience as well, you're not doing like deep therapy, right? Like you're doing a lot of crisis interventions, and you're doing a lot of prevention, and you're doing a lot of like family like short interventions as well. And I think with time, and that's been my journey over the last 6 years since I decided I want to be like a full-time therapist. I wanted to try things that, because there was always something lacking for me,
Mm.
which I think was like, how does that connect with the body, for example? Like I don't want to, I felt like I want something that is just not just cognitive and not just behavior, but something that it also connects with the body, like how much of what people go through physically has like an emotional connection, right? That's one thing. And the other thing is I wanted to try like an approach that was not pathologizing, like not just diagnosing and treating for a certain diagnosis, which I think is important and is part of the training if you're a therapist, but also something that feels more gentle with the client. Because in my experience, when you are talking to someone who has been diagnosed with something, my feeling was like it becomes part of the identity of the client, and that can be problematic. So that's why when it was actually Cindy who got the training in IFS first, and she told me about it, and I really resonated with that part, which is this is non-pathologizing. This is very gentle, and this is like you're talking to the client as a whole, and there's no bad parts. And so
hmm
that's what got me curious. And I don't know if I answered your question, but that's been like in a few words, basically my journey. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Yeah. And for you, Cindy, what was it? Because
Yeah,
wait,
I've been listening to Tali, and then of course it spurs thoughts with me. And my master's program was not so long ago. So
Mhm.
I'm, in between your two experiences. Um, So certainly after I had my school counseling experience and qualification, it was very much more like how Tali was describing this, what we call sort of top down, like looking much more at behaviors, and then maybe the more you got to know students, there were ways to help them with their thinking patterns. There were ways to help them with motivation, with the types of
Hmm.
questions that you would ask or how you would support them, right? And how you would sort of help them just sort of see what the possibilities were for them so that
Hmm.
things could feel better, things could look better for them. And, often that was very specifically around behaviors that weren't working well in a classroom and or with their peers and adults that they were interacting with. And or of course the academic piece, right? So I think we were dealing with a lot of the thinking brain. And so we thought talk a lot about top down therapy, right? Well, when I started my master's program, certainly at that master's level, they are, in my program, they are touching more upon these scientific, evidence-based methodologies that are more like cognitive behavioral therapy. I mean, those are the ones that I actually had one full class on that, and that was really interesting. My professor was fantastic as well. So I
Hmm.
found CBT very interesting. Um, but then I also had profs who maybe they weren't teaching us about the modality they were using, but you learned about the modality they were using through some discussions. And then that was also interesting. I had an existentialist prof, and she
Hmm.
was kind of wild for me because she had such a unique and different approach, almost jarring to me, actually.
Hmm.
It was like a first experience of imagining if I was an existential therapist, how I might be with my clients.
Hmm.
And I remember one prof saying, to try to answer the question as best I can,
Hmm.
try not to worry about it at this moment when you're in your master's program, when you're in your practicum, just experience. I think he used the analogy like, go on many dates, right? Don't marry one methodology. That was his way
Hmm.
of explaining it. So really try to see what's out there. And then, basically we were coming up with this narrative in my master's program that we were integrative therapists, like we were integrating variety of models and modalities,
Hmm.
tools, again, depending on how you like to speak to your clients. But so that's really where we were in our master's program. And then when I came out of the master's program, which is not that long ago, I don't even really remember exactly how I found out about IFS. Tully, I don't have a huge recollection, but all of a sudden, when I started looking into it, it's what made sense to me as well. And I thought,
Hmm.
I have to try this. I have to get, seriously trained in this. So took a course that ran over 4 months and,
Hmm.
again, just learning the foundational pieces of IFS, but it still makes sense to me. It's not the only modality I would use. It doesn't feel comfortable or right for all of your clients. So that's another important piece, right? It's also you can choose to say I'm only an IFS therapist or I'm only a CBT therapist, but that hasn't been my choice. Um,
Hmm.
yeah.
Quite a few things I want to unpack there, but
Okay.
both perspectives super interesting. The first thing, because I was earlier just writing down so I don't forget, um, what you mentioned was or both of you actually mentioned it because both of you were school counselors before, and both of you mentioned this, and I'm curious what you meant by the top-down processing. So you had more of a CBT experience. Could you even say that? Would it be CBT as a school counselor in a way?
Yeah. Yeah.
It
I
would
think
be.
so.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
CBT, have
Okay.
you heard of motivational interviewing? I find that was also something that would be something you could look
Mhm.
up. It's called motivational interviewing. I believe I
In
have that correct.
would you be able to,
Um,
in one sentence, explain what is it? What it says? It like motivational interviewing, understanding the
yeah,
intention behind them, or is it less?
using questions to spur on sort of thinking and how someone would like to approach a situation.
to get them motivated,
Yeah, to
or
sort of help them with their next steps if they're stuck or
okay.
if things aren't working well. That's, without doing a quick little search,
Mhm.
that's sort of how I remember it.
Mhm.
And then there might be other tools that you're using in schools that come directly from things like dialectical behavior therapy. That's a big one, I would say.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Because
And
again, it's
Yes.
looking at behaviors that aren't working and
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah. And I would
shifting
add
them.
to that, yes, I would add to that that basically what you do in a counseling approach that is more like CBT oriented is like you're connecting thoughts with emotions. And that's why it's like bottom down approach. Like, so you're approaching the thoughts first, like
mhm.
the mind, the cognitive aspect, then like the emotions that are connected to that, and
Okay.
also the behavior that is basically like showing
Mhm.
after, I don't know, let's say you're working with a student who has self-esteem issues. There are a lot of negative thoughts which trigger negative emotions and they show like in a certain set of behaviors. So
Mhm.
you're working like with this chain
Mhm.
basically. And again, like you're not doing like deep interventions because this is a school where you have 200, 300 students. You can't
Mhm.
do therapy. So you do like brief interventions basically, and sometimes you have to find like external referrals for certain cases. And there is this like opposite, I don't want to call it opposite, but like this different approach, which is like, I don't know if it's the right term, but it's like bottom up.
Mhm.
It's like the
Mhm.
other direction, you know? So you, IFS, for
Bottom up.
example, yeah, you start by finding in the body of the client,
Mhm.
like what where this, I don't know, thought or situation or like discomfort is happening. And then from the body, like you start elaborating
Mhm.
like the emotional, the cognitive. And I think for me as a professional, it going back to this idea of integ- integrating,
Mhm.
it makes sense because then you're not just working on like the head, the cognitive aspect, but you're integrating what is happening in the experience of the client, which is happening in the body as well.
Mhm.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Totally. I
Yeah.
What I wanted to add was in my experience so far, and I've only studied psychology for what, 3 years now. I've already started thinking about what type of therapy would I want to give though. And it also has to do with the therapy I've received in the past, which has influenced my, I would say my preferences. But that will probably change or might change if I have more experience. What I wanted to say though is for me personally, what I noticed to be nice would be my preference would definitely be something that integrates different modalities, which is I think what both of you said. And something I've also noticed that as a therapist, you don't have to go down one line. I think you mentioned that, Cindy, that your professor said that you can integrate multiple modalities and create your own type of therapy preference, which is something I actually did not know beforehand at all. Correct me if I'm wrong. At the end of the day, as a therapist, it's up to you. It's a unique experience.
Yeah.
I'm guessing you
Mhm.
guys can elaborate on that before I have another question then. But exactly, that it's a more personal decision you can make and integrate. I guess you guys could say, yes, we base it on internal family systems, but there's nothing that speaks against, for example, integrating some CBT, if I'm right. I'm not 100% sure on that.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
you're right. I'd say you're right. And I would say there could be some exceptions definitely if you're doing agency work, let's say hospital work, depending on a certain clinical environment that you might be in, they might actually have what she must be using as your
Enforce
modality,
certain
right?
stuff.
So
Got
Tali
it.
and I are both
Yes.
talking about having a private practice
Hmm.
where we can
Exactly.
choose.
Yes.
So I would just, yeah, I would just clarify there,
Yeah.
Manuel. But as
Hmm.
someone who's opening your own practice, yeah,
Yeah.
you're free to choose. And it does make me think a lot about just emotional regulation in general and how that's such a big topic right now, like what Tali was talking
Mm.
about. Um, and how we might integrate different modalities because that emotional regulation, yes, it's thoughts, emotions, but that body, yeah,
Yes.
reactions are so clear, right? Which you also work with when you're working with students, where does that
Hmm.
show up? How
Yes.
do you notice that you're
Yes.
not in the best place? And then they can
Yeah.
mention things like my heart's racing.
Yeah.
Yeah, my
Yeah.
stomach feels sick.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I think as
Yeah.
humans, if we're not looking holistically at all of those areas that Telly was just mentioning, I mean, we're really doing a disservice to ourselves and our clients. Yeah.
Yes. And I would add that I know there are therapists who just offer one modality, even IFS. Like I think we mentioned that last time. There are IFS therapists who they only work with IFS clients, and this is like a very specific methodology, right? But in my experience, you don't know which tools you will use
Hmm.
until you've had a couple of sessions with your client,
Hmm.
So I think the good thing about this like integrative perspective is that you are using the tools that work best for one client and they're not the same that will work for the client afterwards. So I think a lot of and we've talked about it before, a lot of the I don't know, the criteria that will help you make the decision is this bond that you are creating with your client, right? So at the beginning, like you're trying to build a relationship, you're building like a safe space for your client, but then depending on the situation or the client, you may use more CBT
Hmm.
because the client feels a bit more safe with that. Or there are clients who want to explore like really deep, and then you will use different tools. So I think that's why it is also so important that this is like a matching
Hmm.
between the client and the therapist. So no, I am a firm believer that you can't use the same approach for every client, and there are clients who just don't respond well to certain approaches, or they feel. I've had the experience with IFS where people, like some clients, don't feel comfortable or they don't understand it, or it takes a few sessions before you can start trying it because it feels very different.
Hmm.
So yeah,
Mhm.
I
When you
think there's
mentioned,
not yeah.
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Maybe you want to say it.
No, no, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
What I wanted to mention is the word tool. Tools you mentioned for the therapy modalities, which I haven't heard before, and I find it the perfect description for those modalities. At the end of the days, you're right. It's like having a toolbox, and I would personally argue, if for me as a therapist, the more tools I have in my toolbox, the better of a therapist I am. Might be a controversial take. It's what I personally think with the knowledge I have right now. I just think if, like you said, you have these different type of clients, and I feel as a therapist, you would limit yourself if you focus exclusively on CBT. As you said, some people, they might just react differently. Some people, they just want their goals, they want to do their tasks, and that's how they feel most comfortable, and that's how they will better themselves. Other people really just want to connect more with themselves. And if you as a therapist have these different tools in your toolbox and can utilize them correctly, perfect. Then more people you could potentially help. The only question with that is probably, which I'm actually not too sure about, you guys probably know more about that, is how do you properly learn these different, for example, internal family systems? I know there's a certain certification you can get. So I'm guessing it's a course you can take. But I'll be honest, I'm not sure how it looks like with CBT. with existentialism, if you have to go to a specific school, because in the bachelor degree, I know for a fact they don't teach you this. So what's that like?
Manuel, I mean, there are so many trainings.
Mhm.
It's a bit overwhelming, I'm going to be honest.
It's overwhelming, yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
it can be very overwhelming and it can really bring up lots of things in therapy, in me as a therapist. Like, I'm not doing enough. I should be doing, so the
Wow.
imposter
Okay.
syndrome thing can come up, right? I need to be doing more trainings. And then you also realize, like, you can't just live in the trainings because, to be honest, how do I learn how to help a client with maybe a tool if that's one of the things that's showing up in a session that I think there's something that could be helpful for them to have in their toolkit, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Part of that is also me having experience with a variety of different clients and
Hmm.
learning how to best reach my clients and teach. I might be teaching them that tool. We might be using it together to experience what that might be like if they were to. So, for example, let me try and give you an example.
Hmm.
One area that I really like to work with clients on is self-compassion, learning how to be kind to themselves, just learning how to catch those moments when they're being really hard on themselves. And there's an exercise that I'll take them through. And I typically would take any client who's sort of up for that experiment through the exact same exercise, which comes from Kristen Neff, who is a guru for me in self-compassion.
Hmm.
And I just use her exercise. And how did I find that? Not through a training, but basically through my own research. She has a
Okay.
website. You can go right to her website, and she has
Hmm.
different exercises. And that's the one that resonates with me
Yeah.
so strongly that it seems to help clients. So I hope that answers part of your
Hmm.
question.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It is doing your
Yeah,
own
I would,
research. Yeah.
yeah. And I would add, Manuel, when you are in like psychology undergrad, you are studying, that's my guess, you're studying with people who not necessarily want to be therapists, because psychology is like this broad universe. Some people want to be like HR, some people want to be like more like social workers, like psychology is so broad. So once you've decided you want to be a therapist,
Hmm.
I think you have different approaches. And those different approaches have different modalities, and those modalities have different tools, right?
Mm.
So my, I guess my suggestion would be if you want to be a therapist, I would start by a similar master's than the one that Cindy did, because it's applied for psychotherapy, but you're touching on different approaches. And
Hmm.
then what you can do is like if you find this approach interesting, then you just go for training. And there are trainings that are 4 days, 5 days, 1 month, 4 months. You don't necessarily have to do 6 different masters, right? So I
Hmm.
think for me, like this journey was like first psychology, then I did my specialization in logotherapy, existential therapy, which then led me to other trainings. So I did mindfulness training, and then I did IFS, and I've done like other short trainings. And then it can be so specific that maybe you just want to do a weekend training in assessment for ADHD, for example, because that's something that you're noticing in your clients a lot. I think that also that changes a lot. So 10
Hmm.
years ago, like you would see like things in your clients that are different to the things you're seeing right now. And
Mhm.
then maybe you want to get a specific training in that. But yeah, I would start with that. Like if you want to be a therapist, you probably will feel like you're not ready when you finish psychology,
Hmm.
right? And then you also don't feel ready to pick one modality.
Hmm.
It's just hard. So maybe you want to do something more integrative, and then from there you start collecting tools that you
Hmm.
can use with any approach. I don't know
Hmm.
if that makes sense.
That definitely does. I, it, first of all, definitely most people in the bachelor with psychology, they probably either don't know or don't plan on becoming a therapist, so it definitely makes sense. And from what I've heard from you guys saying is that never in uni do you really get properly taught. You probably get experience from the professors about these modalities, but if I understood correctly, the actual training behind whatever modality out there, there's just specific courses you do outside of university to further educate yourself, correct? So I guess in uni you would just learn the fundamentals of what's important, and then afterwards you can develop your own style or go to specific courses to, yeah, learn more about whatever it is you notice that you resonate with most,
Yeah.
right?
So I have to say this all the time as a college placement counselor, and it would always be a bit frustrating. It depends. I mean, there are some master's programs, although I don't feel there are very many that are this way
Mm.
anymore. But for example, I think it's in Toronto even. I remember doing some research. There's one program that's just for Gestalt. There's another modality that you might have heard of coming from where you're
Mm-hmm.
from, but Gestalt, yeah.
Yeah,
Um, and then really you're graduating as a Gestalt therapist.
let's see.
So most people entering into something like that would maybe have a bit more experience, right? Than
Mm-hmm.
maybe they've ex I don't know. Of course, it depends on everyone's experience, why they would choose that. But typically, as Tali mentioned, a master's program that's more broad and sort of a wider view, I think can be really beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you get to experience some things, take a little bit of time. Yes, sometimes you do feel really nervous, like I should be choosing.
Mm-hmm.
But usually you'll receive a lot of advice that it's okay, you can take your time. And the only other thing I want to add to this is it can be very expensive, right, to choose your trainings when you decide to go down a formal training route. But there are a lot of free things out there. Shout out to my supervisor. She used to call me the resource queen because I can find resources. So I would find things on websites that were free or maybe great podcasts. Maybe you already have some podcasts you love to listen to. Um, and if not, if you choose to be a psychotherapist or a therapist, you'll find those podcasts that will feel really helpful for you to be listening to. And there are free trainings. For example, the last thing I'll say, if you check out PESI, PESI, they offer free trainings, not all of them, but enough that you can take a free training on CBT. You can take a free training on DBT, which I mentioned earlier,
Mm-hmm.
dialectical behavior therapy, and just try it out. And it didn't cost you money. It costs you time and
Mm-hmm.
effort. But
Mhm.
um, yeah,
Yes.
highly
Yeah. And I would
recommend.
add that part of the training that I find is extremely important, I would say it's like a must if you're a therapist, is you have like your supervision or your intervention like groups, or you have a supervisor. Um, because yeah, you can get so many trainings, free trainings or not free trainings, depending on what you want. But at the end of the day, you really need to zoom out of your practice and share it with someone. And I think for me, that's been like a very important part of my training, even if it's not like formal training, but it is helping me reflect on my practice a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, yeah, I mean, personally and professionally, it's like a huge part of who I am as a therapist. If you don't have this supervision or intervention sessions, I think it's very easy to just, yeah, I don't know, like just be too like digging deep into your practice with the client, but you're not reflecting on it. And I think that's part of the practice.
Mm-hmm. How important would you guys say choosing or having a certain modality you specialize in, yeah, tools in the toolbox really are? For me personally, I wouldn't even know what giving therapy would look like when you don't have these tools? As in, what does it help me? What do you really learn during the session? I truly just can't really envision it yet. If I'm here, I'm sitting here, I'm a newly qualified therapist. I'm giving therapy. How do I utilize? Do you learn how to ask different questions, or because we already mentioned, sure, the top down, bottom up difference, but how do you actually approach that during
Mhm.
therapy session?
Yeah, that
Yeah,
brings up a
that's a good
lot for me.
question. Yeah, you go ahead.
Uh, you practice with your peers first, right?
Mm.
So in
Uh-huh.
master's programs that I'm aware of, at least, you're
Hmm.
Mhm.
practicing with your peers. You're practicing with the professor. For example, the professor would be on the camera on the screen right now, but but muted and off camera, but she would or he would be listening to us, and then afterwards would comment and make suggestions and ask us how that went for us. So you do quite a bit of practicing first. Does that
Mhm.
mean when you first work with a client who's not a peer that, not a whole bunch, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going to come up for you when you're doing that. But
Yeah,
again, it's like, how are you going to learn to ride a bike? How are you going to learn to ski? You gotta do it.
Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I'll let
Yeah,
Telly add more.
that's I think that's key, like practicing, because you can know a lot about the modality, but you don't really know how it works unless you're using it. And I would say, as a therapist, for me, the most important thing is presence. So this is something that you don't necessarily learn, but you can have it by practicing it. So you can be really present for your client, and then you can check in with yourself to know how much of the things you are processing have to do with the client and how much of the things you are processing have to do with you as a therapist.
Hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense, but this comes with practice, because you can have a conversation with the client is telling you like a bunch of things and you're not present, or
Hmm.
you're just taking notes, or you're so stressed that you're thinking about which modality or which tool or what
Hmm.
and at the end of the day, I think what really builds the relationship with the client is you're present, you're not judgmental, you're holding the space, and you can separate the things that have to do with you and not with the client,
Hmm.
because a lot of things will happen and it will trigger things that are yours, not the client's. And so having this ability to separate both,
Hmm.
like regardless of the modality that you're using, I
Yeah.
think. And that comes with, as Cindy said, that comes with practice. And we had the same training for IFS, which is, I would say, 70 or 80% of the time you are practicing.
Yeah.
So you
Hmm.
are in a setting where you have like different roles. So you are the client, or you're the therapist, or you are the observer. Um, and I think that I learned more with those hours of practicing that I did with like reading the 5, 6, 7 books, or
Hmm.
like, because yes, you can have the information, but unless you put it into practice, you don't really know how powerful it can be.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you learn many things about how you want to approach a situation with a client when perhaps what you were trying to do didn't land well for them. And that can
Hmm.
be a really important moment with your client too. That does take time and building some confidence in your own skills and that you're worthy to be in the room with them, and to take that time and to take that space out and to reflect a little bit on what didn't work and their thoughts around that. And often they can just then come to their own conclusions and still really get a lot out of what you might be thinking inside was, woof, that was a total fail, or I'm upset that it didn't work out, and then in the end, it can be a really important reflection time for them. So
Mhm.
just add that.
For
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, I do. Obviously, I'm probably too early in my studies to have or even these opportunities to practice. I remember uh, probably one time where I did, or two times until now, which I really appreciate with the uni I go to, where we did have these practicals already, where you were put in a situation, you sat across an actual patient who we weren't sure if she was acting or not, but that's irrelevant. It was just not someone from class, and I volunteered to be in that situation, and I noticed I learned way more in those 10 minutes sitting there and just having to deal with this client, this patient,
Yeah.
freestyling than I did from all the classes where you just read about it. What I also at the same time noticed, of course, in order to be a good therapist and give therapy, you obviously have to understand the mind, the processes, so that you can then approach it correctly. But it's also just half of everything. The knowledge from what we were talking now, you notice that the second part as a therapist is then, yeah, being able to hold the space, being able to listen properly, being able to ask the right questions to then understand them better. And that I would totally agree. You really can just do with practice. And I notice with peers, because I also have friends that are graduating this year and they're going to go to their masters next. They're also just unsure. I don't think anyone ever feels truly ready if they want to become a therapist. It's constantly that, but I need more practice. How can I actually help someone yet? But at the end of the day, you're right. You just have to put yourself out there and learn along the way and trust
Yeah.
yourself. And that goes to show, I guess, the most important quality in the beginning. Sure, you have all this knowledge after your studies, but would be to be someone who can hold the space and listen. So I think the rest would probably unfollow naturally afterwards. If you have those two qualities, being able to listen and create this safe environment,
Yeah.
that's probably the first step for someone to feel comfortable in your session.
Yes. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
agree.
It's true. Hmm.
Yeah.
What I'm
Uh,
also,
yeah.
sorry, but what
No,
I
no,
also
just
asked
go ahead.
was
Yeah.
specifically for the internal family systems, because you mentioned, Tali, that it was also 80% practice. What exactly does that look like? I would like to go a bit more into detail just because I'm really curious about what that entails. And I mean, you both have gone through that and have that qualification. What exactly does that actually look like, internal family systems? How, yeah, like the session with that, what's the, I guess, what's the emphasis put on with that? How does it differ from other modalities?
Yeah. Well, I think, and Cindy probably has a lot to say about it as well. But basically, it's approaching the client from this idea of the multiplicity of the mind. So you're not talking to like the client as just one aspect, but
Hmm.
you're approaching the client as a different, a group of different parts. So basically, like they call them parts in the family, internal family system, but it can be like your different voices or your different thoughts. So what you notice in therapy in general is that people usually, or a lot of the times, they say like, oh, there is a part of me that wants to do, I don't know, divorce, and there is a part of me that wants to stay in my marriage. And that is a perfect example where IFS can be really helpful, because then you are inviting the parts of the client. So basically you start by mapping the parts, you start by identifying which parts are present, and it can be, yeah, like different voices in your head about something, or different feelings in your body about like a situation, for example. And then there is this core idea that we have parts, but we have a self. And that's why IFS is called like a psychospiritual approach as well, because the self is like, you would call it like the divine in you, which is like it has like 8 attributes. I don't remember all of them, but it's curiosity, compassion, um Cindy, you help me with the other 6.
Courage,
uh
calm. Oh
Courage,
gosh,
calm,
creativity,
yes,
I think is one. You said curiosity,
yeah,
huh?
yes,
Yeah,
creativity, yes.
I need my
And
list too.
this, yes, so the self is like this energy that we all have that is non-judgmental, doesn't have an agenda. So basically you're guiding the client to connect with their self and with their parts. Yeah, it sounds more complicated than it really is, but
Mhm.
through the practice, what you're doing is you're identifying these parts. Every part is welcome, so there are no bad parts. And you are understanding the role that each part plays in the system of the person. And that's why it's called internal family systems. I know I'm missing a lot of it. I don't know if Cindy, you
Well,
have any
I
other
don't think you're
thoughts?
missing a lot of it at all. That was a wonderful beginning to it. It has a lot of details to it, right? So it's hard to just share with
Mm,
you, Manuel, in 5, 10 minutes, but Telly gave a great synopsis of that beginning part. So it's like we have this ecosystem within us of parts. And if a client was working with you for 1, 2, 3, 4 sessions, these parts then start to become aware of these parts if they're willing
Mhm.
to go this route of IFS. And as that relationship builds with them and their parts, you ask different questions to the client, how do they feel towards that part? So that part that really wants to get out of the marriage, like Tully just explained, what does that part look like? It could be not just one part if you break it down and get closer and ask the client to go there and what else does he or she notice around that part. And so it's a lot
yeah.
of questions for the therapist to ask with very little other commentary. As a therapist, you're really
Mm,
asking your client to go inwards and meet these parts and see how they feel towards them and what they're learning from them. And it can mean a lot of silence and a lot of
mm,
yeah, like you have to just talk about giving them space. You have to give them some of them a lot of space because they need
mhm,
time to really, they might close their eyes. They might really be trying
mhm,
to access, right, these parts.
Mhm.
mhm,
So that's another
mhm,
interesting part of that piece of IFS as a therapist. The
mhm,
client does, I hope this is okay to say it this way, Tally, too, but I mean, this is sort of how
mm.
they talk about it. Like the client does a lot of the work
Yes.
themselves, and you're
Yeah.
really there guiding,
Yeah.
helping them uncover things, helping them notice,
Yeah.
being there for them with the
Yeah.
things that are coming up.
Yeah.
I-
And what's interesting about this approach as well is as a therapist, you don't come into the client's system with an agenda. You have no agenda, which is the case with a lot of other approaches. You have an agenda, you have goals, you have objectives, you have like a plan. In this approach, you're just like holding the space for the client to go into their system and explore and build a connection with their parts. And a lot of content is coming to the surface, and then you support the client integrating this content into their system and making sense of it. But you're not making any interpretations, you're not giving homework, you're not telling the client how they feel. So the role of the therapist with this approach, I think, is very unique.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. I'm trying to remember. I wanted to say something just earlier. What was it? I don't remember. Me and my friends actually recently on the the road trip, we also quickly, the ones that are going to graduate now, had a quick discussion about it was about the role of a therapist with the client and how much credit you can take as a therapist for helping someone else. At the end of the day, we agreed, okay, it's actually 50-50 at the end of the day, but without the therapist, the client most likely would not have gotten better or to the spot they are now. But it's interesting because you mentioned earlier, and you were almost cautious saying that the the client does most of the work. I do think though
Mm.
that's a common occurrence with therapy. At the end of the day, also me myself included, the client is the one that has to put in the work, has to be open to do the work, and you as a therapist, your job is truly just to guide them in the right direction. And what does that take?
Yeah.
Understand them, and then you're able to guide them in the right direction.
Yeah.
Another thing I quickly wanted to ask was why exactly, I truly think this would help me also understand, okay, how would I personally, as a psychology um, grad student, decide where I want to go later? What exactly made you guys decide, yes, internal family system, like that resonates with me? What about it? That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah. Cindy, you want to go first?
Well, it's so interesting, right? Because near the beginning of this conversation, I said I can't really remember what sparked
Mm.
it for
Mhm.
me. Curiosity. I did hear a lot of people talking
Mm.
about it. And I started just looking at a few videos, looking at
Mhm.
websites. And I definitely saw the videos from Richard Schwartz, who is the origin, he is the one who created this modality. And listening to a few podcasts, and it just made so much sense to me. Just
Yes.
was making sense to me. And
Mm.
other than that, Manuel, I can't really describe much more about how I got there. And then I did make the decision when I mentioned to you earlier about costs of training. I did jump into then, okay, this is where I'm going to put some of, a financial commitment as well,
Mhm.
because those trainings
Yeah.
aren't cheap. So
Okay.
Yeah.
I was trusting it enough that this made the most sense for me to actually like invest, yeah, in the training.
Yeah. Yeah.
And from
I think for
there,
me,
yeah,
yeah.
went forward.
Yeah. First time I heard about it was from Cindy when she was doing her training. And we actually had I think a few sessions where I was being the client and Cindy was being the therapist. And I could experience it as a client, like how compassionate and gentle this approach is. And it really like sparked my curiosity. And I started like reading about it and I joined like a waiting list because these trainings are not just expensive, but you have sometimes there are just no spots for you as a therapist. Yeah, and I think it's been one of the best investments I've done as a professional. It gave me not just the tools, but it really trains your presence as a therapist, not just like the like how much you know or how many tools you're using, but you're spending a lot of time holding the space for the other person.
Mhm.
And that can be scary at the beginning, and that can feel like so much is being triggered within your own system as a therapist.
Mhm.
um, I think they do a beautiful job in this training, and yeah, I wish maybe I do like level 2 or level 3 in the future. I don't know. Yeah.
Mhm. Just as a final note, you mentioned level 2 and level 3. What more would you learn in that modality? I don't know if that's a thing for CBT as well, or if it's IFS specific.
I'd say
I mean, yeah, Cindy, you go ahead.
I think it might, I don't know, I can't say for sure, but IFS definitely has that protocol, level one, two,
Yeah,
three, and then trainers.
yeah.
Um, so something we didn't talk about there are exiles. There are exiles that are also part of this methodology, and they tend to be our younger parts, our wounded parts, the ones that are holding on to a lot of pain.
Hmm.
And typically, if you're trained in level one, it's harder to sort of get to those exiles, although sometimes you will and you do, and then you work through them with your client. But I think that the next levels then just go deeper, right? And just give you more
Yes.
time and more practice and certainly
Yeah.
more experience with the exiles.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And there is certain, like, I don't want to call them pathologies, but diagnoses or situations where IFS has proven to be very, very successful. For example, addictions or eating disorders. So you can also pick like level 2 or level 3, like going into like a specific direction. Like you're doing IFS for couples, or you're doing IFS for addictions or trauma. So level 2 and level 3, you can also pick like a specific like the specific focus that you want to give to your practice.
Hmm. Perfect. What I really appreciate about these conversations is just that it's interesting to have these different experience levels in the three of us. And for me personally, it's just super interesting to hear, well, first of all, the actual experience with these different modalities. And at the same time, also now today, talking with you guys, I'm noticing, okay, you don't have to have this 100% like path, goal, vision of what exactly you want to do. It just happens with time and with
Mm.
experience. One last
Yeah.
closing question I wanted to, which I just thought off the top of my head, would be, which I think, yeah, I personally would also want to know, but for the two of you, if you were in my shoes right now, what advice would you give yourself? And in this way, I guess, what advice would you give me? But if you were my age.
um, Thank you, Manuel. I really appreciate your question, and like how, like open you are to learning, and how like you're great at leading these conversations, I think. Um, my advice, I think, would be if you can practice like in university, or if there's like a practicum or internship or something, so you can start learning more about yourself as the kind of therapist you want to become. And if you're choosing a master's, I would do something that is more like integrative as a psychotherapist, like the one that Cindy mentioned. And then you can pick like thousands of tools that you want to incorporate into your practice. But I would also say, like, just try it, and you don't have to be an expert to start like practicing in some settings, like these internships where you have a supervisor, or these programs at university where you're offering some services and the students are doing it. And you start with that, and then you start identifying what resonates with you more before you go into like a formal training,
Mhm.
if that makes sense.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. And you, Cindy, what would you?
Yeah, wonderful advice from Tali. I would start by saying, Manuel, you're already showing this amazing curiosity, and it's just a natural part of you. And I think moving forward, that's going to be something that will just continue to be such an important, like,
Mhm.
foundational piece. I would just say, remind yourself about how powerful curiosity
Mhm.
is. And I see
Mhm.
that as a
Mm.
natural thing that you have. And then I would add, because Tali's advice is all wonderful, and so I would just add, trust this process, trust your intuition, trust the process will unfold as you keep looking at it with this curiosity that you have. And yeah, I would leave it at that for now.
Mm.
Mm.
Amazing. I bet a lot of, psychology graduates, master students are thinking the same thing as me. And hearing those words for sure, in a way, I bet would calm their nerves a little bit. At the end of the day, you still have to go through it yourself, but knowing that, you guys who have the experience would say this, I bet that helps.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Manuel.
Thank
Thank
you,
you
Manuel.
both.